LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the August 25th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like my show. I'm back at my regular location this week, and I've picked out the weekend's 11 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which should be a really educational, informative, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. The political comedy I have for you is from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, the monologue from Bill Maher, and it's actually right on my main topic, which is Trump's tirades. He had that weird news conference that I actually made an edited, produced video that I premiered on Friday. If you go to my channel, youtube.com/liberalviewer, and you can't miss it. It's Trump versus Obama, who did Putin outsmart, which was one of many crazy things that Trump said in that news conference, and then he had all these Twitter tirades, and that's something Bill Maher makes fun of in the political comedy. Before I get to all the news clips, I have three different Democratic presidential candidates: Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Bernie Sanders. I have two Trump administration officials. Oh, I actually have a Republican presidential candidate, Joe Walsh, in the final clip that I'll get to at the end. He's running against Trump in the primary to be president. So that's kind of bad news for Trump. And there was a lot of bad news for Trump, which may explain why he was going off on these tirades that, as I said, Bill Maher made fun of. And down in the video description, you can see the entire Bill Maher monologue. You can also see a link to my clip list. This is the list of 11 clips, my notes that I read along, and I'm looking at my, this is Bill Maher making a few fairly good jokes about Trump's tirades. The irony about it, well, I'll tell you the irony about the cranky old man jokes that you're about to hear from Bill Maher after we watch Bill Maher make them over in this clip.
He's crazy. He is off his rocker. He's giving hour-long press conferences on the White House lawn. Brought to you by Adderall. The President of the United States stands in the driveway every day and screams at people. I mean, I know a lot of old guys are like, get off my lawn. He's like, get on my lawn. The suit saves it. It's all about the suit. Really. If he wasn't wearing the suit, ordinarily people who do that are wearing a bathrobe with the garden hose in their hand. Hey, let me tell you something. The president is the inflatable, arm-flailing tube man outside of the car dealership. That's who he is.
And I cut that before it got to some of the off-color jokes that I didn't think were as good. There were a few good jokes in there, like I said, but the irony, of course, is that, as I've discussed last week and for actually years, I guess, about Bill Maher, is that he's kind of getting to be the cranky old man of the liberal comedian establishment, if there is such a thing, where he's almost like, hey, you millennials, get off of my lawn. And he's like making fun of Trump for, well, get onto my lawn. That was the name of the monologue, was get onto my lawn or whatever. But it was on the topic, the Trump tantrums and the Trump tirades, excuse me. And there were a lot of different issues. It's like some of the scandals in the middle of the week where, like, Trump was accusing Jews of being disloyal if they weren't supportive of the current government of Israel. And it was like, I think a lot of these things are included in the best, as usual, news summary from NBC News' Meet the Press. Chuck Todd starts off with, where we're wondering, should we take Trump seriously when he says all these things? And then, of course, he crashes the stock market, and there are all sorts of real-world consequences. That's the introduction from Chuck Todd. Then he goes to the package, which is all the video from the week of all the Trump craziness. It's 4.5 minutes. I hope you can survive it. Like I said, the best, most thorough news summary as usual from NBC News' Meet the Press that I will discuss with you after we watch it together over here.
Good Sunday morning. For much of this week, we wondered whether we should take what President Trump says seriously anymore. By the end of the week, we were reminded that the words and actions of the most powerful man in the world do have real-world consequences. In just the past few days, the president was not interested in buying Greenland. Before, he was so interested that he postponed a trip to Denmark when the Danes wouldn't sell. On tax cuts, Mr. Trump was against new ones. Before, he was for them. Before, he was against them again. And stay with me on expanded background checks on guns. The president, who was traditionally against them, then was for them after El Paso and Dayton, against them reportedly after talking to the head of the NRA, then apparently for them again, but now maybe not. This is not a left or right issue. It's a fact or fiction issue. But there was no denying the implications of what the president was saying and doing on Friday. Both China and Mr. Trump escalated the trade war that Mr. Trump has initiated. The president flirting a bit with authoritarianism with this tweet directed at America's business community. Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. The result of the president's tweets, the Dow plunged more than 600 points as the president headed off to France for his G7 meeting with world leaders who are already nervously eyeing a slowing world economy threatened further by trade wars. Donald Trump came into office promising to discard traditional alliances and practices. And for better or worse, he has delivered on that promise. But now real questions are being raised about whether the United States can continue to be counted on to provide the leadership the world has come to expect from it since the end of the Second World War.
We're getting a lot of money in tariffs. It's coming in by the billions.
As President Trump meets with U.S. allies anxious about a slowing global economy, his own volatility is raising questions about his ability to manage the world's largest one. The president is ratcheting up his trade war with China, threatening to raise taxes on Chinese goods.
Presidents and administrations allowed them to get away with taking hundreds of billions of dollars out every year.
Claiming sweeping emergency powers to, quote, hereby order U.S. companies to cut ties with China.
In 1977, we had an act passed, a National Emergency Act. I have the absolute right to do that.
And attacking the Federal Reserve chair he appointed again, tweeting, "My only question is, who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Chairman Xi?"
Do I want him to resign? Let me put it this way. If he did, I wouldn't stop him.
Some of Mr. Trump's own allies say the president is increasingly worried about a recession and are concerned his own focus on the darkening picture could be self-fulfilling. The president himself just can't seem to stop talking about it.
The word recession is a word that's inappropriate. We're very far from a recession.
The fake news, of which many of you are members, is trying to convince the public to have a recession. Let's have a recession.
You people want a recession because you think maybe that's the way to get Trump out.
And the president's erratic style has been on full display. On Tuesday, he floated a tax cut.
Payroll tax is something that we think about.
By Wednesday, he said it was not on the table.
I'm not looking at a tax cut now. We don't need it. We have a strong economy.
He is using messianic language to describe himself.
Somebody had to do it. I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it. So I'm taking on China.
Tweeting conspiracy theories and zigzagging on basic policy. This week, reversing himself on guns.
I think we can do meaningful, very meaningful background checks. We have a lot of background checks right now.
And even on buying Greenland, after claiming
we may be going to Denmark, not for this reason at all.
On Tuesday, he canceled the trip, saying, based on the Danish Prime Minister's comments, that she would have no interest in discussing the purchase of Greenland. The business community is wary.
It's just like another one-way ticket on the Titanic.
And 2020 Democrats are already taking advantage, running on a return to stability.
We're witnessing a president of the United States who's become more and more unhinged. We know the words of a president matter. They can move markets.
I don't know what the president is thinking when he says he can just hereby order companies to do this or that. We need an economy that actually works for all of us.
And joining me now from the G7 in France.
And the one thing that was not in that news summary, like I said, was the most comprehensive. I think it showed how erratic Trump has been. I mean, that's the thing. He's not an ideologue on policy. In fact, he usually takes like all sides of an issue at some point and then pretends he's always been on the side that he is right now. It's a hard thing to oppose someone who is on all sides of the issue at one point or another. I mean, he did used to be a Democrat, right? I mean, later I'm going to show Pete Buttigieg talking about how Trump is not the beginning of the problems of the Republican Party, and then Joe Walsh in the last clip is actually going to take some responsibility for creating Trump. But Trump is in some ways sort of, I guess, what do they say, sui generis, one of a kind, that he's there's nobody quite as like the mixture of all the erraticism and tirades and possibly malignant narcissism, as I discussed on the program a couple weeks ago. That all like was mixed together very well in terms of policy and just emotional outbursts in the NBC News Meet the Press clip. Later, they had an update where they talked about the whole second thoughts controversy, which I'll be showing some newsmakers from Steve Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow talking in various ways about Trump saying things that are the opposite of what he meant somehow. But that is covered in the much shorter CNN State of the Union news summary, where Brianna Keilar is in for Jake Tapper this week, and the State of the Union is a world of worry. Can't really argue with that in this 70-second news summary from CNN this morning here.
Hi there, I'm Brianna Keilar in for Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is a world of worry. This morning, President Trump is putting on a smile as he meets with world leaders at the G7 gathering in France, insisting on Twitter that everyone is getting along very well. At a friendly working breakfast with new British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, President Trump expressed his first sign of possible second thoughts about his trade war with China.
You have second thoughts about escalating the war with China?
I have second thoughts about everything.
Now, the White House is trying to spin the president's words, saying that he regrets not raising the tariffs higher, even though that was not at all clear from his comments. Still, despite the president's positive words, there are clear signs of division among allies over trade and foreign policy. The European Council president began the session warning of a recession from escalating trade wars and saying this is the last moment to restore unity among world leaders. This all comes after a week in which the president triggered another stock market slide with a single tweet and escalated the trade war with China. Let's go right to France.
So you have a lot of the same information there. The stock market crash from the tweet, and you saw the Trump second thoughts there, and the controversy on the second thoughts, as you'll see later in the show, is whether the second, when he said I have second thoughts about everything, does it mean he has second thoughts about putting on the tariffs or not putting the tariffs so high? But actually, when I first saw that quote, I was thinking the controversy for me is I often think Trump doesn't have first thoughts about a lot of things. So to say he has second thoughts about everything, that seems, well, it's not like everything Trump says is true anyway, but that doesn't seem very true to me. That does not ring true to the Trump that I have come to know and, well, you fill in your own verb, for the last couple years, or actually going all the way back to July 2015. So it's been over 4 years now that Trump has increasingly dominated the news, as he is again this week. But I want to show you this next news summary. It has a type of media bias in it that I point out every now and then. It's not like a partisan political bias. These shows often have a bias for the guest that they have exclusively on their show. And ABC this week with George Stephanopoulos had this guy Joe Walsh, this former Illinois congressman who is running for the Republican presidential nomination against Trump. He's not even, I think he's like the third person doing that. But you can see that even though this ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary is the same length as the one we just saw from CNN, for some reason Joe Walsh's candidacy rates and the challenge to Trump from Republicans is rates much more coverage, just because that's the ABC exclusive guest, as I will talk a little more with you after we watch that clip together over here.
Stephanopoulos. Good morning and welcome to This Week. I alone can fix it. That signature line from 2016 pretty much sums up Donald Trump's approach to the presidency. And this week, he pushed it about as far as it can go, with a dizzying series of impulsive moves on everything from buying Greenland to background checks on guns. Tax cuts on and off the table, then back on again. Attacks on China and the Fed that sent the stock market into a tailspin and threatened the strong economy that's been his best selling point for re-election. And as we come on the air this morning, a new political threat, a potential challenge from one of his own. Conservative firebrand Joe Walsh, a Tea Party congressman, now a talk radio host, and no stranger to controversy and incendiary rhetoric. Once a staunch defender of President Trump, he appeared on CNN this week and said this.
If Republicans, John, stay silent in the face of this guy, I don't think the country will ever forgive the Republican Party, but forget about the Republican Party. If this guy gets 4 more years, we're in real trouble.
And Joe Walsh joins us now. Good morning.
Hey, George. Good to be with you.
And like I said, the last clip, if you're following along on the clip list, clip number 11 is George Stephanopoulos versus Joe Walsh on how he used to be Trumpier than Trump, and you'll see Joe Walsh takes responsibility for helping create Trump and Trumpism, which will be an interesting contrast to the clip before that. Pete Buttigieg also talking about where Trump comes from. But before I get to all those clips, I have one more news summary and, one more news summary and 4 other newsmakers before we get to those last 2 clips. If you're counting along, because I can see all the clips arrayed in front of me here on my Wirecast software that I'm using to broadcast my live stream to you all. And this last news summary is Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace, and then John Roberts, the reporter. And as usual, this is, it's not as bad as, Fox and Friends, but it's definitely somewhat sanitized in the Trump TV type talking points. If you are looking at my notes, you'll see this is clip 5, and it talks first about how Trump's back on the world stage, and it doesn't talk really much about Trump's trade war, but it's like a trade escalation. Even though Trump kind of instigated it, it doesn't really put the blame so much for the trade war on Trump. It does talk about the problems of it. And also when it comes to the second thoughts issue, it says he never says second thoughts. Trump can never, reservations. He has reservations. And then it also, immediately gives like the way they walked it back and he wants the tariffs to be higher. And then when it comes to this thing where you saw in some of the other news summaries that Trump I hereby order companies not to do business with China. They don't even show that tweet. They just show like the walk back of it, like what administration officials are now saying, that they want companies to look for other places they might do business, but not like Trump hereby ordered them. That doesn't show up in the Fox News summary. So I guess I've kind of pre-criticized the partisan bias after showing the media bias in the last clip. Almost 50% of that last clip was devoted to Joe Walsh. That seems a little bit extreme for a news summary, but compare that to the partisan bias from Fox News Sunday this morning over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. President Trump is back on the world stage at a critical time for the global economy as trade disputes are raising fears of a recession. All eyes are on Mr. Trump to see how he'll navigate tensions with allies at the Group of 7 Nations summit in France. One of the big questions, just how far he'll go in his standoff with China. In a moment, we'll speak exclusively with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who's at the G7 with the president. But first, John Roberts has the latest on the president's trip. John.
Chris, good afternoon to you from Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is just a short distance away from where the G7 summit is being held. And the escalating trade war between the United States and China really taking center stage here. At a breakfast meeting with the new UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, President Trump asked this morning if he has any reservations about where the trade war is headed.
Mr. President, any second thoughts on escalating the trade war with China?
Yeah, for sure. Why not?
Second thoughts?
Might as well.
You have second thoughts about escalating the war with China?
I have second thoughts about everything.
After President Trump's comments were interpreted as regret for the trade war, the press secretary later said if the president regrets anything, it's not raising tariffs higher. President Trump did say he has no plans at the moment to invoke emergency powers to force American companies to stop doing business with China, also insisting he is under no pressure from G7 allies to end the trade war.
I think they respect the trade war. Presidents and administrations allowed them to get away with taking hundreds of billions of dollars out every year, putting it into China. So the answer is nobody's told me that. Nobody will tell me that.
In his first meeting with President Trump since becoming UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson mildly voicing his dissent.
The UK has profited massively in the last 200 years from free trade. Prime Minister, we don't like tariffs on them.
As the trade war with China remains on a hot boil, President Trump today announced that he and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are very close to rewriting their trade relationship.
If it gets done, we'll possibly know by the end of this meeting.
Another topic of sharp controversy at the G7, President Trump's desire to invite Russia back into the fold and resurrect the G8.
I think it's advantageous. I think it's a positive. Other people agree with me, and some people don't necessarily agree.
Next year's G7 summit will be held somewhere in the United States. As the host, President Trump can invite anyone he wants to the summit, even Vladimir Putin. Chris?
John Roberts reporting from the G7 in France. John, thanks for that.
So I pretty much pre-criticized that clip, although if you want to see the whole G7 versus G8 controversy and whether Putin outsmarted Obama and hurt his feelings, and that's why Obama kicked Putin out of the G8 and it's now the G7, which is what Trump said in his press conference this week. Go over to my channel, youtube.com/LiberalViewer, and check out my latest edited produced video, which it got, almost as many views as a Sunday live stream, and that particular video didn't take too long to make, so I guess it was satisfying to... maybe I can do more of those in the future. But one thing I also wanted to say about that last news summary, that I notice that when Trump talks about the trade deficit with China, he doesn't really seem to understand what a trade deficit is. He said, China was taking all, billions and billions of dollars out of the United States all these years because of the trade deficit. But the trade deficit just means that we buy more of their stuff than they buy of our stuff. So, we end up with a whole bunch of extra stuff, and they end up with a whole bunch of extra dollars. That's the trade deficit, how many dollars they end up with. But that doesn't mean that they're, taking the money because we're getting all this stuff for it. It's like saying, I have a trade deficit with Safeway because every week I go and I spend all this money there, and all I get is all these groceries, and at the end of the year, we have a tremendous trade deficit because they have all my dollars, and I have all their groceries. That doesn't mean they're taking our money. That means we're spending our money. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that our president does not know what a trade deficit is, among other things that makes me worried about the future of our nation. But speaking of being worried about the future of our nation, I want to show a couple representatives of the Trump administration who try to double talk their way into explaining what Trump means when he says stuff like this. I criticized Fox News Sunday before I showed that news summary for, they did show where Trump said second thoughts, but they didn't introduce it that way. They said reservations, but Chris Wallace did cross-examine Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, about that, and then also did cross-examine him about the place where he ordered companies to no longer engage in business in China. But the part I want to show you is where he cross-examined Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, about the President of the United States tweeting in the last few days that the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, is more of an enemy to the United States than President Xi of China. And the funniest part about it is that Steve Mnuchin's first response is, "Oh, we didn't mean to say that President Xi was an enemy. Nothing about the chairman of the Fed." But this is about 3.5 minutes And Chris Wallace follows up on that, and there's some actual real sort of news in here about American policy towards the protests in Hong Kong, if you're interested in that. That's like somewhere in the middle of these 3.5 minutes that's mostly about Steve Mnuchin trying to explain Trump's crazy tweets over in this clip.
I want to ask you about another tweet from the president on Friday, and let's put this up on the screen. My only question is, who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, or Chairman Xi, the president of China? Question, does the president really regard the chairman of the Federal Reserve, whom he appointed, to be an enemy of the country? And I guess a larger question, which is, with all of these statements from the president, all of these tweets, how seriously, how literally should we take what the president says?
Well, Chris, let me first comment on the President Xi side of this, because I was with President Trump today, and he was very clear that President Xi is still his friend. He has a very good relationship with President Xi. We've worked on lots of different things together. But as it relates to financial issues and trade, we have become enemies. We're not making progress. But this was not intended to send a message that President Xi is his enemy in the sense of all these different areas. And the other thing I would say is we're very hopeful that there will be a humane solution in Hong Kong. We're obviously watching what's going on there. The president again reiterated he thinks if President Xi sat down with the protesters, he could get this over with in a few hours. So we're hopeful that there will be calm in Hong Kong.
Well, let me pick up on that. If there isn't, if the Chinese were to crack down as they did in Tiananmen Square in 1989, what impact would that have on U.S. relations with China?
Chris, I'm not going to speculate because that's not the outcome we're hoping for. The outcome we're hoping for is a peaceful outcome. I think there was a deal with the UK when Hong Kong was transferred over. We'd expect China to meet that deal. It's something we hope we respect. They respect the laws and they respect what's going on there. But President Trump is hoping there will be a humane solution there.
So you were at pains to say, well, Chairman Xi is not an enemy of the country, but you didn't say the same about Fed Chairman Powell.
Well, I really wanted to first comment on President Xi. On Powell, I don't think it was a literal comment that he's an enemy. But again, my position on the Fed is that I don't make specific comments about the Fed. I meet with Chairman Powell weekly, and as my role as Treasury Secretary, I don't comment specifically on the Fed.
But this does bring up the bigger question, which I do want you to address, which is, for Americans, whether just people investing, CEOs, when the president says something, how seriously, how literally should we take it?
I think most of the time you should take it very literally. I think sometimes he says things that are meant to be a joke. Obviously, the comment, that recently on The Chosen One, that was said tongue-in-cheek. That wasn't meant to be a serious comment. I think most people know the president is serious about China and trade, so people should understand that. He is very determined. He's trying to correct something that's gone on for the last 20 years where we have a very unfair trading relationship that's been a tremendous disadvantage to U.S. companies and U.S. workers, and he's working hard to rebalance that.
Now, when Chairman Powell spoke at that Fed conference out in Wyoming on Friday, he said...
So, yeah, that's the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin trying to explain some of the crazy stuff that Trump has tweeted. By the way, I think I referred to the chairman of the Federal Reserve as Jerome Powell, but I guess he's J. Powell. Does the J stand for Jerome? No, I'm not sure, but I guess they said J. Powell, and then I also said Chairman Xi, and then corrected myself to say President Xi of China, but I guess he's both chairman and president, or they referred to him as both, but whatever. That was the Fox News Sunday cross-examination of Steve Mnuchin on that particular craziness of the President of the United States in his Twitter feed. And I actually thought Brianna Keilar did a really good job with Larry Kudlow. And this is, I believe it's the longest clip of the night. And I kept it going. I thought of maybe editing it down, but I just really like the way Brianna Keilar, she lets Larry Kudlow, go, let me make my point. Let me finish my point. She lets him do it. But then she follows up with, I'm just saying what the president actually said. And that's the weird thing about, you'll see, if you check my notes here, we're on clip 7, you'll see that, first he claims that on the second thoughts thing that Trump didn't understand the question, even though if you saw the news summaries earlier, Trump he actually repeated it. He said, I have second thoughts about everything. So how could he not understand the question when he repeated the premise of the question in his answer? So that's one big Trump administration lie there. Then he talks about that he meant the high tariff thing, but that's the first half, and then I will criticize the second half after you watch Brianna Keilar really nail down Larry Kudlow on the president's own words, his own words, over in this clip.
So the president said that he's having second thoughts about escalating the trade war. Why?
Well, look, if I can reinterpret that, he spoke to us. He didn't exactly hear the question. Actually, what he was intending to say is he always has second thoughts, and he actually had second thoughts about possibly a higher tariff response to China. So it was not to remove the tariff. He was thinking about a higher tariff response. Having said that, we're staying with the policy that was announced on Fridays, I believe, a 5% increase on the 2 tariffs, the first 250 and the second 300. September 1st and December 15th. And let me just say on this
he's
point,
thought, I just want to be clear on this.
China
So he has thought that he might want to increase the tariffs, but he isn't actually going to increase the tariffs beyond what he initially did.
That is correct. At the moment, that is absolutely correct. That was his thought. It somehow got misinterpreted. I'm not sure he heard the question altogether. It was a very crowded room. I was there. But yeah, his thought was perhaps he needed to go higher. And my thought to you, Brianna, is simply, look, China took an action. It was a moderate action, a proportionate action. The president took an action related to China. As again, I said 5% plus from the original 250 and the next 300 or so, with the same due date, September 1st, December 15th, the same exemptions and waivers for a bunch of companies, consumer-related companies.
I do.
In my judgment, these are measured. Hang on a second, if you will. I want to just complete this thought. These were measured, proportionate thoughts. One point I want to make. Second point, Brianna, if I may, the conversation, the discussion between the China side and the U.S. side continues. Negotiations continue. There was a successful, constructive deputies negotiation by teleconference last week. I believe another one is being scheduled for this coming week. And I also want to say that at least the U.S. side is continuing to plan for a visit from the China side sometime in the month of September. So the negotiating talks continue. That's an important point, I think.
But just to be clear on where his mind is on all of this, you're saying that this is because he would have considered an increased tariff, that actually he would have wanted to have more, but he is not, as you said, going to actually increase those tariffs. He also said he's no longer planning on forcing U.S. businesses to leave China. So it does seem as if he is softening on this issue broadly.
Well,
you disagree with that?
Hang on, if you. Well, a little bit. Look, again, this is about what he was thinking this morning. I think the early reporting was confused, but I'll leave that aside. Regarding the larger point, okay, so what he said last week on the tweet is he can't order business. He's not ordering business. There's no emergency powers being invoked.
He said he has the authority to do that.
He merely said he may, as I said, there's nothing right now in the cards. Ultimately, we do have such authority, but it is not going to be exercised presently. What he is suggesting to American businesses, and it's something he has said to many companies in many different forms and many different occasions, you ought to think about, to the companies, you ought to think about moving your operations and your supply chains away from China. And secondly, we'd like you to come back home. Back to the USA, where we have very low corporate tax rates and massive deregulation program, and our economy is doing just fine right now. And so come home, come back to America.
I want to ask you about how he's being.
A lot of firms have.
He didn't say you oughta. He said he ordered. Larry, just to be clear, he didn't say you oughta. He said he ordered. But I do want to talk about how this is being received there.
Well, he didn't order. He did not order the businesses. He just. I know he said, "I hereby order," but what he said to them in effect was that you begin to look or you begin to search for ways to move.
Well, I'm just thinking about what he actually.
I'm
just thinking about what he actually tweeted. To be clear, the words that he tweeted. But I want to ask you about what's going on where you are.
I want to ask why ask him about what's going on where he is when he can't actually honestly say what we saw with our own eyes. That was like the. Are you going to believe me or your lying eyes defend? I know he said, I hereby order companies to no longer do business with China, but that's not really what it means. It means that they should start looking for other places to do business. He's not ordering, even though he said that was just like some high-grade Trump administration bullshit. It's really low-grade. It's not like other presidential administrations didn't mislead us or use talking points to try to mislead us from what they were actually doing. But the thing is that how can you tell us what Trump said, I hereby order, doesn't mean I hereby order that. And kudos to Brianna Keilar. I think she pretty much held Larry Kudlow there to account for the dishonest double talk he was trying to peddle there on CNN's State of the Union this morning. This next clip, I don't see as dishonest double talk. This is one of the Bernie Sanders is a politician. You have to admit it. He's been a politician for most of his life, but I think his answer here, I'm actually juxtaposing it to Amy Klobuchar's answer to pretty much the same question over on CBS's Face the Nation in the next clip. And this is the point that's really important from these next two clips, is that what Trump is doing with China, the goal, the problem that he is actually attacking is not a fake news problem. It's not a made-up problem. China does do things that disadvantage the United States, that hurt American workers, so that's not all made up. It's just the way he's taking it on is, it's crazy and chaotic and irrational. I think Bernie Sanders is going to say that it's erratic, and Amy Klobuchar will say chaos. I think Amy Klobuchar actually has this great meat cleaver soundbite that I'll talk about after we watch the Bernie Sanders answer, where tariffs aren't necessarily wrong; they're tools, but not when you're like an erratic, crazy person. And while sometimes Bernie Sanders sort of looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, who, the crazy mad scientist, whatever, he actually makes a lot more sense than Larry Kudlow, Steve Mnuchin, and Donald Trump put together, I think, in this next clip.
Joining us.
My pleasure.
I want to start on the G7, where one of the major topics is the U.S. trade war with China. President Trump escalated his tariffs on Friday after China promised new retaliatory tariffs. You've made clear that China is treating the U.S. unfairly when it comes to trade. And I understand that you don't agree with the president's tactics or his style. But if you were president, would you use tariffs to negotiate a deal with China?
That is one tool that you have. What the president is doing is totally irrational, and it is destabilizing the entire world economy. You do not make trade policy by announcing today that you're going to raise tariffs by X percent and the next day by Y percent, by attacking the person you appointed as head of the Federal Reserve as an enemy of the American people, by denouncing the president of China, who last year you really loved as a great leader. this kind of instability and irrationality on the part of the president is causing very serious harm to the entire world economy. Yes, we need a new
I
trade
understand your
policy.
criticism of that, but you say this would be a tool. Is it a tool that you would use? Would you use tariffs?
Yeah, of course. It is used in a rational way within the context of a broad, sensible trade policy. It is one tool that's available. What we need is you're looking at somebody, by the way, who helped lead the effort against permanent normal trade relations with China and NAFTA, because trade policies that we have had in the past have lost us millions of good-paying jobs and were written primarily by large corporations at the expense of workers and farmers. We need a rational trade policy today, not what Trump is doing by tweet.
I want to talk about Medicare for All now.
So I think that's an important clip for people who wonder how progressive Democrats can appeal to those white working class Trump voters in the Midwestern Rust Belt, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and even Minnesota was almost a swing state. This next clip is Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, and she takes actually a much more centrist tack on the same issue, though just like Bernie Sanders, she doesn't say that she won't ever use tariffs as a tool to fight China unfair trade practices. Neither of them go so far as to say they support the TPP, which was the Obama administration solution. It was basically the TPP was an alliance of all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, except for China, allied with the United States to create like a trading bloc to counter the power of China in that region. But the problem was it was negotiated to the great advantage of corporations, to the disadvantage of workers. There weren't like labor and environmental standards, and that's why people on the left opposed it. And I'm not exactly sure why Donald Trump opposed it, because he was trying to seem like an advocate for the working man, and I think that Bernie Sanders did a lot better job of explaining how to fight on trade for working people than Trump ever does. And then Amy Klobuchar even does a better job, although she's much more centrist. You won't see her coming out against NAFTA and other trade deals, but she does say that she would consider tariffs, talking to Margaret Brennan on CBS's Face the Nation, answering almost the same question that Bernie Sanders answered on CNN's State of the Union this morning over here.
Good morning, Margaret.
You said before on this program that you agree with the premise of challenging China, but you do it with allies and you wouldn't use tariffs. How exactly would you get them to the negotiating table?
Well, right now you have complete chaos, Margaret, and you can use tariffs, but not the way this president has been using tariffs. He's been using them like a meat cleaver, or maybe the better word is a tweet cleaver. And when you look at what he's done, just on August 1st, he announced 300 billion goods, more tariffs. Then on August 13th, they reversed it. Then on August 20th, they said they were going to do taxes because of the fears of recession. They were going to reduce taxes, which of course would only add more to the debt that he's created. And then the next day, they reversed that. And I think one common adage when you deal with the rest of the world and you want to have credibility for our great country is that you keep your promises and you keep your threats. And what he does is he makes these blustering threats, like kicking all of our companies out of China, that people don't think really he's going to follow through on. So what I would do is go back to the negotiating table with our allies, examine these tariffs. Some of them can come off. Some of them could stay on, and then make sure that we're using trade enforcement. I had my own experience with this to keep Minnesota iron ore mines open because of Chinese steel dumping. And at the end of the Obama administration, we called for and passed some laws, got more enforcement going, and they opened up again. That is not the careful, targeted approach that this president is doing. And as a result, you've got soybeans sitting in bins in Iowa. You've got pork down to its lowest export levels in 9 years. This is starting to hurt everyday Americans because of the chaos that he's created.
Democrats are running on.
So Amy Klobuchar on the Trump chaos, showing some empathy for farmers in Iowa, of all places. Why Iowa? Oh, that's right. The first caucus. And Amy Klobuchar has qualified for the debate at the end of September, I believe, sponsored by ABC. Is it September 30th? And I think they have about 10 people now. Bernie Sanders, who I showed in that last clip, and I think he gave a better answer, but that was also at least a more... an answer more congruent with the facts than anything you saw from the Trump administration or Donald Trump himself this week on trade, even though Amy Klobuchar is probably too centrist. And I've talked multiple times about my problems with former prosecutors who haven't, made an outstanding effort to fight mass incarceration. If you want to know why, read this book here, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. That will tell you all about why mass incarceration is a huge problem and prosecutors are complicit unless they've made like an outstanding effort to fight it. That's one of my problems with Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, but that is a big digression. But I think that she's likable. I think that she could take on Donald Trump, and I would vote for like any of the candidates who have been in the Democratic debates over Donald Trump, even Marianne Williamson, even Andrew Yang, and I say even them because they are not regular Democrats, they're outliers. And this next clip is actually the first of the two clips about, the response to Donald Trump. One is Pete Buttigieg, the next is Joe Walsh. And in this clip, I think that Chuck Todd treats the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, like he's some like weird outlier, that something that should scare the American people. I don't know if it's because he's gay or because he's a mayor and hasn't had like national exposure before this campaign, but in a lot of ways he's a lot less scary than Donald Trump. I mean, he has military experience, he has elected executive experience as a mayor, which is actually a real job. I have been involved in local politics here in Sacramento for a lot of issues, and the mayor, we have a weak mayor here in Sacramento. It depends on the city, where there's actually like a paid position for the executive. The city executive does a lot of the work, but I don't want to get into all that stuff. But I don't know in South Bend, Indiana, whether Pete Buttigieg is a strong mayor or a weak mayor, but I don't know why Chuck Todd treats him as scary here. But he does talk about this dilemma for Democrats as to whether they have to spend all their time saying, we got to get rid of Trump, or should they spend time on presenting something new and different and something that the American people want? And Pete Buttigieg actually opts for the latter, but I don't think he really presents details of, he talks in sort of these vague generalities that sound good but don't have a lot of substance, as I will discuss with you after you watch Pete Buttigieg talking about what Democrats need to do to defeat Donald Trump over here.
Welcome back. Democratic presidential candidates face their own dilemma. Do they argue that whatever differences voters have with them, President Trump needs to go because he's unfit for office, essentially the Biden message? Or is restoration and preservation of the Obama legacy simply not enough? Should the right response to the election of Trump be to campaign on new and bolder ideas? Mayor Pete Buttigieg joins me now from Freedom, New Hampshire. Mayor Buttigieg, good to see you again. And let me just dive right into that question, but ask it this way. This was a week where the president certainly had some erratic moments. As you know, many voters have that safe harbor mentality, especially during weeks like this. This strikes me as particularly challenging for any candidate not named Joe Biden, any candidate that wasn't a former vice president. How do you talk to those voters?
Well, I guess what I would say is this. The president is certainly a problem, a big one, but he's not the only problem. Ask yourself how a guy like this ever got within cheating distance of the Oval Office in the first place. I would argue that doesn't happen unless the country's already in a kind of crisis. And we see it in the fact that for pretty much as long as I've been alive, even when the economy has been growing and quickly, most Americans haven't been getting ahead. One of many reasons why in places like the industrial Midwest where I live, back to normal is not going to be a good enough message because normal was not good enough. Of course, there are huge problems with this president, especially now. We're not even debating whether the president is telling the truth or making sense. We're just debating whether it matters when he doesn't. And it does matter, as you can see by the way he has created turmoil in global markets with his words. But even so, getting rid of the president is not enough. We need to replace this presidency with something better that actually works for Americans, or somebody even more unstable could gain power and emerge in our politics in the future.
Well, as you know, the counter argument is going to be, whoa. Trump was a big risk. Trump was somebody we'd never tried before. You're asking voters to take a big risk in that sense, too. It is, I understand exactly the message you're trying to send there, but that is the other side of that message, which is, well, wait a minute, he was new and different, you're new and different.
Yeah, there's some very different versions of what new and different means.
Fair enough.
My presidency will be about making sure Americans can actually get ahead, that when we have a rising tide, it actually lifts all boats, in addition to restoring American credibility around the world. We need to explain what we're going to do to make your life better. And the less we're talking about him, the more we're talking about you. Good news is, this is winning turf for Democrats. Remember, the American people, broadly speaking, agree with us on wages, agree with us on health care, agree with us for sure on gun safety. When it comes to the things that are actually going to decide whether your kid is safe at school, whether your income is going up, whether your health care is secure, whether there's a good outlook in your everyday life, that's a winning message for us, and we need to explain what we're going to do on that. Out with the old, compelling though it is not a complete message.
I want to talk about
and like I said, that was definitely cogent argument from Pete Buttigieg, and I agreed with everything he said there. I haven't heard a lot of details as to his policy positions. He seems to be kind of more middle of the road. I heard him say that he took the Medicare for all who want it position, which is kind of like the Biden position, basically a public option that enhances Obamacare, and maybe that is a winning position. It's just the main contrast, I think, in that last clip, as I said before I showed it, is Chuck Todd saying, "Oh, you're so new and different, you're so scary, just like Trump." And Pete Buttigieg, I mean, I guess he's gay and he's not a nationally known figure, and in that way he's new and scary. Is that new and scary to people? But otherwise, he's a pretty conventional Democrat and fairly centrist, kind of like Amy Klobuchar. If you want to see someone who's really not centrist, who's actually right-wing, that's this last clip I'm going to show you that I talked about, the Joe Walsh clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. George Stephanopoulos asked him a bunch of things, I think, that kind of revealed the inanity of the Joe Walsh presidential run. I mean, if Joe Walsh is the solution, you have a problem that you probably don't want to solve, in my opinion. But I followed Joe Walsh on Twitter for a long time, and other than having said things that are anti-Trump for years, not soon enough, not when Trump was running for president, but soon after, I guess. And that was one of the things George Stephanopoulos brought up about how he supported Trump up to the end. And I don't think that's in this clip. This clip is the Washington Examiner, a conservative outlet, quote that George Stephanopoulos asked Joe Walsh about, asking him, you're Trumpier than Trump. And then you'll see the follow-up about some of the racist things he said about Obama. And I guess the best thing about the Joe Walsh presidential campaign is seeing Joe Walsh admit that he is partly responsible for creating the environment that made Donald Trump possible as the Republican nominee and president of the United States, as I will talk about a little more with you after we watch that final 3-minute news clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning over here.
I do.
they're afraid to come forward.
You said you want to make the case against the president. The question is, are you the best messenger? You said you want to make a moral case against the president. Here's what the Washington Examiner, conservative newspaper, said in response to your potential candidacy this week. There's the matter of his history of being Trumpier than Trump. He's made a living on peddling the same sort of demagoguery, conspiracy mongering, and right-wing bomb throwing for which he now condemns the president. Your response?
I helped create Trump. And George, that's not an easy thing to say. Look, we were divided before Trump. I went to Washington 8 years ago, the part of the Tea Party class, wanted to shake Washington up. I got involved in the battles, and there were plenty of times where I went beyond the policy and the idea differences, and I got personal, and I got hateful. I said some ugly things about President Obama that I regret. And it's difficult, but I think that helped create Trump. And I feel responsible for that.
You did provide aid and comfort for the kinds of things he was saying. You mentioned Obama. You called President Obama Muslim, an enemy, a traitor, and you often spoke out on racial themes. I want to show a couple of tweets that you had right there. Number one, we lowered the bar for Obama. He was held to a lower standard because he was black. That was just in 2017. And then a few months after that, not just President Obama, Senator Kamala Harris said something really dumb. Meh. If you're black and a woman, you can say dumb things. Lowered the bar. That is kind of textbook racism and sexism.
Well, again, the beauty of what President Trump has done is, George, he's made me reflect on some of the things I've said in the past. I had strong policy disagreements with Barack Obama, and too often I let those policy disagreements get personal.
Did you really believe he's a Muslim?
God, no, and I've apologized for that. And that's not an easy thing to do, not at all. But think about the contrast, George. Again, I'm burying my soul with you right now on national TV. We have a guy in the White House who's never apologized for anything he's done or said. I think it's a weakness not to apologize. I helped create Trump. There's no doubt about that. The personal, ugly politics. I regret that, and I'm sorry for that. And now we've got a guy in the White House, George. That's all he does. Understand, I walk around with this piece of paper every day, George. It's got all of Trump's lies on one side, mostly updated, and then everything that he does that's wrong. I feel responsible for this, but I'm a conservative, and I think there's a decent chance to present to Republican voters a conservative.
What is the conservative case? Set aside the.
And actually, add a link down in the video description. You can see the entire This Week with George Stephanopoulos episode and see Joe Walsh make the conservative case for why Trump is not a conservative, which is pretty easy if you're looking at the deficits and the tariffs and all sorts of things that conservatives used to be against and whatever. But like I said, I'm not a big fan of Joe Walsh. I mean, I'm happy to see that the Trump presidency has made him reflect on his racism and sexism. That kudos to George Stephanopoulos. He brought up from there was that one of those was 2017, and when the Kamala Harris one was that. Whatever. You won't see me voting for Joe Walsh in any circumstance. I mean, well, I don't know. Maybe if I really thought about it, because I did vote for John McCain against George W. Bush in the 2000 primary in California because Al Gore had already wrapped up the primaries, and I wanted to push the Republican primary more towards the stupid conservative supposedly John McCain was a maverick back then, so I guess that was an instance when I voted in the Republican primary for somebody who was not as bad as the person who eventually won. So maybe there's some circumstance like that I could, but no, you won't. I'm never voting for Joe Walsh over any Democrat, and I don't really see him as better than Trump. The only thing that's better than Trump is the fact that there's somebody running against Trump, and then there's a couple other people running against Trump. Maybe that'll become a real thing. And apparently one of the reasons Trump has gone on these tirades and become so unhinged is because he sees his presidency coming apart, maybe bad economic news that is the result of his stupid trade war with China that isn't going to resolve before the November 2020 election. I don't know, that's what some of the pundits were saying. If you go down to the video description and watch all 5 of the news shows I just summarized for you, if you want to support me continuing to take clips and add my commentary to those clips from those news programs, you can support me many different ways, like these people on Super Chat did today. Thanks Sexy Bob, Chrismer, Lulu Girl, and Andy M for those Super Chat contributions, or Chrismer for motivating one of those Super Chat contributions. So there's Super Chat contributions for the live show. Down in the video description, you can give a direct contribution on PayPal or Patreon at the $5 level. You will get this weather-resistant vinyl #LiberalViewer sticker. At the $10 level, you have to give me your shipping address on PayPal or Patreon. But at the $10 level, you get this Constitution and the sticker. I can send these pretty much anywhere in the world. I just sent one to Thailand, of all places. So anywhere in the world, $5 for this, $10 for this. Help support my channel. Also, thumbs up, subscription, supportive comments, of course. If you want to keep me doing this, I will be talking more about that before the end of the summer. I will be adding a way to join a channel membership through YouTube. That's something I'll be adding in the next couple weeks. I'll talk about some more edited, produced videos and other features that I will give previews for people who support me financially in various ways. But anyway, that's my program. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be back next week and every week for the foreseeable future, at least through the November 2020 election anyway. And until next week, or until I have some reason to give you and I was going to give you a Dash and Sandy clip. I almost finished without the Dash and Sandy clip. Wouldn't that have been terrible? But here's Dash and Sandy. Right now, Sandy is lying down right there in the entryway to my normal studio, and I was outside the studio looking in, and I got a little bit of Dash Sandy interaction. Sandy lying down, doing almost nothing as Dash the cat walks in front over here. So there you go for the Dash and Sandy fans. I almost forgot the Dash and Sandy clip, but I'm here at home with Dash and Sandy, so there you go. And until I have some reason to upload another edited, produced video, or until next Sunday, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.